The 1957 to 58 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham is one of the most iconic Cadillacs in the Marque's history, and it's pretty easy to see why. One look at the vehicle, from its Dagmar bumpers up front to the stainless steel roof up top to the pointed fins out back, as well as the extremely lavish interior, connote luxury at the highest level. The 1957 to 58 Eldorado Brougham is also arguably one of, if not the best-looking four-door hardtop ever produced. Some might argue that the 57 to 58 Eldorado Brougham was really General Motors' response to the 1956 to 57 Lincoln Continental Mark II, an equally beautiful vehicle, but certainly a very different one, and not only in body style. Continental Mark II was a personal luxury coupe, maybe even the first personal luxury coupe of the modern era, whereas previously mentioned, the Eldorado Brougham was a four-door hardtop. Regardless, about the only thing that the Mark II and the Eldorado Brougham shared was that they were extremely expensive and didn't sell well. That said, the 57 to 58 Eldorado Brougham did usher in a particular feature the cars before it hadn't really had, and that is quad headlights. You may not realize it, but cars prior to the Eldorado Brougham really had single headlights, or one on either side. Of course, the Tucker was an exception to this rule with its middle headlamp that turned along with the wheel. But in general, cars all the way back to the 30s just had one headlamp on either side. Part of the reason for this was simply outmoded laws that many states had that forbid automakers from selling vehicles with quad headlamps. This is one of the reasons why the 1957 Plymouths, although they have a certain quad headlamp look, one of the so-called headlights is really nothing more than a dummy light that is used as the turn signal as well as the parking light. And this would be the inner lamps on the 57 Plymouth. However, Cadillac wanted to press ahead with this quad headlamp design on the 57 Brougham, and in fact, the design was quickly approved by all 50 states, and it really became the industry standard 1 year later in 1958. And the reason for this is that the 57 Eldorado Brougham really employed a different philosophy when it came to these quad headlamps. While the outer lamps would certainly serve as the low beams, and that was nothing but typical during the time period, the inner lamps would serve as the high beams, but importantly, when the high beams are on, not only would the inner lamps be illuminated, but also the outer lamps would be illuminated with a high beam as well. In other words, 4 lights would be illuminated when the driver depressed the high beam switch and activated the high beams on these vehicles. Having 4 lamps shining light down the roadway versus just 2 was clearly a safety feature in many regards because drivers could see better at night. And Cadillac had an aiming system for the headlamps that aimed to reduce glare and minimize effects for oncoming traffic. More specifically, the lamps on the driver's side of the vehicle were adjusted downward a bit more than those were on the passenger side of the vehicle. And this was because the lamps on the driver's side would obviously be the ones that most impacted an oncoming car, particularly in city or country traffic. Regardless, this trait of the 57 to 58 Eldorado Brougham really set the standard for the motoring industry, and in 1958 you saw a proliferation of the quad headlamps, and really many automakers didn't go back to the single headlamps until they were looking to save a bit of cost in later years. One other feature that helped reduce glare for oncoming traffic was the Autronic eye that Cadillac placed atop the dash, an automatic headlamp dimmer that could effectively sense oncoming traffic and would automatically dim the headlights so that oncoming traffic didn't have to deal with the bright lights. And then once the traffic passed, the bright lights would again be illuminated. This was a pretty popular feature on luxury cars, including the Eldorado Brougham, but also Cadillacs and Lincolns, all the way into the 1980s when the feature was somewhat outmoded by the fact that many more people traveled on freeways as opposed to country 2-lane roads. And if you traveled on the freeway, there always was some form of oncoming traffic. And a lot of people found the continuous dimming and then illumination of the bright lights annoying. And while the 57 to 58 Eldorado did introduce that unique feature for the time with the quad headlights, it also did introduce another feature to the automotive industry, and that was the world's first air suspension system for a car. And it was standard on the Eldorado Broughams not only in 1957 to 58, but all the way through the 1960 model year. This air suspension system on the 57 and 8 Eldorado Broughams is not the same as the system that was employed later by General Motors for the 1958 model year as an option across other makes like Oldsmobile, Pontiac, as well as Buick. That suspension had a two-piston air compressor that was driven off of a belt from the engine and was continuously supplying air. The 57 to 58 Eldorado Brougham had a completely different setup that centered on the use of an electric air compressor that was only engaged when incremental air was needed to be added to the system. Interestingly, the idea for the system on the 57 to 58 Eldorado Brougham really came from GM's truck and bus division, where they had been producing buses with air suspension since the early 1950s. Of course, across the pond, other marques had also introduced air or hydropneumatic suspension like Citroën did in the mid-1950s. In any case, Cadillac felt it was time to give it a try on this Eldorado Brougham, and both front and rear, the car's suspension system was redesigned to accept these air springs. The idea was to help provide the car with a better and more level ride, perhaps something similar to what Packard actually was doing in the years before the 57 Eldorado Brougham was introduced, with self-leveling torsion bar suspension. But on the Cadillacs, air was used to level the car overall and was supplied to the springs through three leveling valves. There was one at each rear spring for a total of two at the rear and one at the front overall for a total of three combined. The car was set up to adjust to loads front and rear more frequently when it was parked versus when it was being driven, as obviously drivers wouldn't want their car to be bobbing up and down as the leveling suspension was doing its work. Overall, the system worked decently well on the Eldorado Brougham, and it certainly worked much better than the two-piston belt-driven setup that many late 1950s GM vehicles had, either standard or as optional equipment. In any case, the 57 to 58 Eldorado Brougham, as I mentioned, was not only a tastefully beautiful car, but introduced a few technologies to the motoring public in the United States. And it's still one of the vehicles that is revered by collectors, both for its rarity as well as its beauty, and perhaps even its unique features. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on some of the features that the 5758 Eldorado Brougham introduced to the U.S. motoring public. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.